Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and we're back here with another edition of Rough Drafts. So, I'm still trying to figure out how to do the intros for these. Last time we did a sort of countdown of the 10 top combos in Cube, or my 10 top combos in Cube. This week we're going to do something a little different. We are going to talk about one of the Cube archetypes I really like, and kind of it's almost a video primer for how to draft Reanimator in Cube. So we're going to focus specifically on one archetype, and that is blue-black Reanimator. There's actually a bunch of different ways you can go with Reanimator. Red is good because it gives you some faithless lootings, and also other ways to cheat big creatures into play, like Through the Breach. Green has some cards that are alright, like Survival of the Fittest, Genesis, I guess, if you want to go on like a value Reanimator, like mid-range plan. White offers some Wraths and other removal spells that can be helpful. But to me, blue-black Reanimator is the best Reanimator deck, and has those two color combinations have the most cards for building a Reanimator deck in the Vintage Cube. So we are going to go through the different cards. These are the cards that you want to be on a lookout for if you are going to try to be the Reanimator deck in Vintage Cube. So first off, obviously, we need reanimation spells. These are the three best reanimation spells in the Cube, I think in order of power level. First we have Reanimate. Reanimate is super powerful because it's only 1 mana. Yes, it loses you life equal to the creature's converted mana cost. So if you're going to reanimate an 8-drop, you're going to lose 8 life. But the reason this is so nuts is it allows you to do crazy things like reanimate a Iona or Grizzlebrand on turn 1 or turn 2, with the help of something like Entomb or Careful Study to get the card in the graveyard. So it's just so fast and so powerful. I think it is clearly like in the Nut Reanimator deck, and you probably hear me use that term, Nut Reanimator deck, and I'm talking about like an all-in, trying to build like a legacy-style Reanimator deck, which is all in about getting the most powerful creature possible on the battlefield as soon as possible. In that type of deck, Reanimate, I think, is easily the best reanimation spell. We also have Animate Dead. Doesn't cost you any life, and if it dies, the creature leaves the battlefield. So if you reanimate a big creature with Animate Dead, your opponent doesn't have to kill the creature. They can just kill the Animate Dead and you lose the creature. And it gives the creature -1, -0, which is really absurd, because who really cares if your 7/7 or 8/8 gets a -1, -0 on turn 2? But I think it's the second best reanimation spell behind the Reanimate. Then we have Necromancy, which is really tricky. Basically, what Necromancy says, it takes 20 lines of text to do it, is reanimate target creature, and you can play Necromancy with Flash, but if you do, you will sack that creature at the end of turn. So you can use it for some cool surprise things, to like reanimate something, to get an enter the battlefield trigger, and then chump with that creature. So sometimes you can do tricky things with it, but typically, if you're trying to reanimate a Grizzlebrand or Iona or some creature like that, you want to cast it on your main phase so that creature sticks around. So those are the three big reanimation spells. Also of note, there are some wacky reanimation spells. I wanted to mention them because they are in the Cube, but I don't really like these in the Reanimator deck we're talking about. Recurring Nightmare is awesome in like a value Reanimator deck, like the green-black Reanimator deck, for instance, where you can take advantage of mana dorks and things you can sacrifice and keep getting back acidic slimes or Muldrifters or other value creatures. But it's not that great when you're playing only 3 creatures in your deck and your plan is to somehow get your 3 big creatures, or one of your 3 big creatures, in the graveyard and reanimate it. Living Death is kind of the same way. It's super powerful if you're playing a deck that can just stock your graveyard. If you have Survival of the Fittest and can just get like 8 creatures in your graveyard or 5 creatures in your graveyard, it can win the game all on its own. But when you're only playing a couple of big creatures, it's a really inefficient way to get one of them back from the graveyard. Finally, there's also this instant speed Reanimator package. Makeshift Mannequin, Shallow Grave are part of it. These cards are not very good in a typical Reanimate deck either. What their purpose is to get back things that will shuffle into your library. So if you're trying to discard and somehow reanimate an Emrakul, you're going to want a Makeshift Mannequin or a Shallow Grave because of that pesky shuffle into your library trigger. I typically don't like to play those in a straight blue-black Reanimator deck either. If you're on the Emrakul or Progenitus plan, they're fine, but if you're just trying to get an Iona or Grizzlebrand, you want to get one of the reanimation spells from the first page. Then you need ways to fill your graveyard. So clearly the best of these is Entomb. It's a 1 mana tutor, instant speed, that puts a card directly in your graveyard. So this is how you get like a turn 1 Grizzlebrand. You take and play a Swamp and a Moxjet, then you Entomb, then you Reanimate, and you have Grizzlebrand on turn 1, or Iona on turn 1, or whatever big creature you are trying to reanimate. Buried Alive, I'm not a big fan of. It's really slow. I think it's fine if you are playing the mid-rangey, grindy, value Reanimate deck that we were talking about, maybe with Living Death or something, because you can put 3 cards in your graveyard. But if we're going on the Reanimate 1 big creature plan, not a big fan of Buried Alive. Putrid Imp is fine, but it is very high variance. You want to be a very dedicated Reanimator deck to be playing Putrid Imp or those style effects, because as a creature it's pretty bad, but it does allow you to put a card from your hand into your graveyard. And then Liliana is just value all around. It lets you discard your reanimation target from your hand, also makes your opponent discard. In all those reanimation spells we talked about, the Animate Dead, the Reanimate, and the Necromancy, they all can target creatures from an opponent's graveyard, so you can randomly make your opponent discard something big and reanimate that if you don't have a target in your hand. So those are some of the better black ways of filling your graveyard, but if we're playing black-blue Reanimator, we get a lot of other ways as well. Luterail Core has Shadow, so it can't really be blocked in cube. It's a 1/1, but whenever it deals damage, you get 2 loot, so you draw a card and discard a card. It's obviously not going to help you reanimate on turn 2, but on turn 3 or turn 4, it really helps improve your hand quality and fills your graveyard. Gifts Ungiven, I didn't put Unburial Rites in this slide because it is technically a white card if you want the combo, but keep your eyes open. There are a couple combos with Gifts Ungiven. Unburial Rites is a big one. You can cast Gifts Ungiven, search for any creature in your library and Unburial Rites, and fail to find the other 2 cards. So say you search for a Grizzlebrand and an Unburial Rites, they both go into your graveyard, you can untap and reanimate the Grizzlebrand with the Unburial Rites. Compulsive Research is just a great value card. You'll play this in a control deck or almost any blue deck, a storm deck, but it also works well in Reanimate because you get to draw 3 and then discard 2. So it not only lets you discard from your hand, but gives you a couple new options off the top of your deck as well. Careful Study, kind of the same thing. This one is really for dedicated Reanimator strategies as well. Because it's card disadvantage, you're spending a card and discarding 2 cards, so 3 cards, and you're only drawing 2. But it's a way you can, on turn 1, Careful Study, discard your big fatty, and then reanimate it the next turn. And Frantic Search, also a Storm staple, but it works in a Reanimate deck as well, because you can draw 2, discard 2, and you untap the lands, which means on turn 3, for example, you can cast Frantic Search, discard your fatty, then untap those lands and immediately have the mana to Necromancy or something. So those are the best ways in blue-black to fill your graveyard for reanimation. Then another thing you really want in a Reanimate deck is Tutors. So these cards are awesome because they can be anything in your deck. So they can be a card to fill your graveyard. You can use them to find your Entomb, for example. They can be a card to reanimate from your graveyard, so a Reanimate or an Animate Dead. Or they can be anything else you happen to need. A card draw spell, a removal spell, a discard spell, you name it. So the best of them is Demonic Tutor. Just 2 mana, search for anything that goes directly in your hand. Second best is Vampiric Tutor, followed by Imperial Seal. They're very close to the same card, except Vampiric Tutor is an instant, but you search for a card, lose 2 life, and you put that card on top of your library. So you want to plan ahead of turn with Vampiric Tutor. Dark Petition is really powerful, but it also requires that you get to 5 mana before you cast it, so it's a little slow, but its mana cost is pretty good. Like, it's right on scale to search for a Toxic Deluge. If you have Spellmaster, you get that 3 mana back, so you can Dark Petition, cast a Toxic Deluge, a Liliana, a Necromancy, or like a Entomb plus a Animate Dead. So you can make good use of that 3 mana, so it's still pretty good, even though it's slow. And then Mystical Tutor is pretty solid, just like the Vampiric or Imperial Seal, except you can only search for instant or sorceries, so it won't help you get a fatty into your hand to discard and reanimate, but it will help you find the Reanimate or a Careful Study or something to discard that way. Then the Fatties. These are, I think, in my opinion, the best reanimation targets in Cube. For me, Grizzlebrand is far and away the most devastating of these cards. If you can get a Grizzlebrand on turn 1 or turn 2, especially in a well-built Reanimator deck that has some interaction and counter spells, you just get so much value because you get to draw into answers to protect your Grizzlebrand, and it ends the game so quickly, and it also draws into more Reanimation spells and theoretically more Fatties as well, so you can usually get a Grizzlebrand on turn 1 or turn 2, draw a bunch of cards, discard another Fatty, and then the next turn reanimate another Fatty, and that pretty much locks out the game. Iona ranges from the best reanimation target if you're playing against like a monocolor deck and get it down fast enough. If you're playing against Burn or Mono Green Ramp, they just really can't beat an Iona. But if you're playing against a 5-color deck that has answers in a bunch of different colors, it's not as good. Sphinx of the Steel Wind is on here because it has lifelink for one thing, which helps you get back in the game if you're behind, and it is almost impossible to beat in combat. Vigilance, lifelink, first strike, flying. But the other thing is it has protection from red and green, so kind of like Iona, if you happen to be up against a burn deck or a mono green deck, it's just purely unbeatable. Like if you get this card down, you are almost guaranteed to win the game. Ulamog is kind of a weird one. It's big and it's indestructible, and it wins the game in 1 or 2 attacks, but it doesn't do anything all that special. It still just dies to a Path to Exile or a Swords to Plowshares. But still, if you're really looking for a reanimation target and can't find any of the better ones, it's fine. Inkwell Leviathan is sort of along the lines of Ulamog. It takes longer to win the game, usually 2 or 3 turns of attacking, but it also has Island Walk and Trample and Shroud, so it doesn't just die to a Path to Exile or something, but it does give your opponent more time to draw into a Wrath or a Balance or something that does deal with Inkwell Leviathan, and theoretically it can lose in combat. If your opponent isn't playing islands and can get enough creatures or one really big creature, they can stonewall the Inkwell in combat. So, but those are, I think, the 5 big ones. But clearly, Grizzlebrand is far above the rest. Iona, for me, is the 2nd tier, and then Sphinx, Ulamog, and Inkwell Leviathan are kind of the 3rd tier. So for me, Grizzlebrand is a sign that if I open a Grizzlebrand, I'm going to try to find a way to get it on the battlefield. It's that good. Iona is somewhat of a sign, and the other 3 are cards I'm looking to pick up late if I'm in the Reanimator strategy. So you also want to play some Cantrips in your deck. Preordain, Ponder, Brainstorm. These are ways to find the pieces that you're missing, and they're just really strong in Cube. The only questionable one on the list is Brainstorm, which ranges from horrible if you don't have any shuffle effects. I think it's unplayable if you don't have fetch lands or another way to shuffle your library, to better than all the rest. If you have ample ways to shuffle your library, it is better than Ponder or Preordain. Then Counterspells. Counterspells are very, very good and very important to the Reanimator deck. Daze and Force of Will especially are good because they're free, so you can play a Grizzlebrand, draw 7 cards, draw into a Force of Will, and even if you're tapped out, use that to stop a Path to Exile or Swords to Plowshares or whatever your opponent's doing. But even Mana Drain and Spell Pierce, other 1 and 2 mana counters, aren't bad. So I definitely try to have some number of counter spells, and they also work well at stopping our opponent's broken plays, which is very important in this cube as well. And then Discard kind of goes along with the counter spells, but I really like Duresses and Thoughtseize in this deck. It's a good way to make sure the coast is clear, and sometimes if you end up on like a backup plan of show and tell or something, that's a way to make sure you're not letting your opponent show and tell something too crazy into play. So that's the other thing I focus on. Once I get kind of the Reanimator package, I will highly pick Thoughtseizes and Duresses, because if you can reanimate a Grizzlebrand or Iona or Inkwell on turn 2, and make sure you can force that through, and make sure your opponent doesn't have a path in hand or whatever, it's a very guaranteed way to win the game. So I think the value of targeted discard goes way up in a deck like this. So that is my key to drafting Reanimate in the Vintage Cube. And like I mentioned, for me, if I open a Grizzlebrand early in the draft, I will try to go in on this strategy because I think it's really good. I know it has some mixed reviews from different pros and streamers, but I think it's one of the best archetypes in the cube when you have the nut deck. Even when people are storming off and doing stuff like that, you can still build a really, really good and really competitive Reanimator deck. The key is to make sure you focus on the answers. You can definitely reanimate a Grizzlebrand on turn 2 and lose if you're just drawing into a bunch of junk that isn't doing anything. So you want to be like a Legacy Reanimator deck, you want to be drawing into Force of Will and Daze, and even Mana Leak and Mana Drain, cards that can protect your combo and stop your opponent from doing something really broken that somehow trumps your Grizzlebrand or your Iona. So definitely keep that in mind, that having the answers that we talked about at the end, the counters and the discard, are really key to being a successful Reanimator deck. I've definitely built Reanimator decks that have had the Reanimate package really well, but still lose because they don't have a way to stop what your opponent's doing, and storming off on turn 3 is more powerful. Like, that will beat the damage of a Grizzlebrand if you're not using Grizzlebrand to draw into ways to disrupt your opponent. So anyway, that's my primer on drafting Reanimator in Vintage Cube. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure to check out the website, mtggoldfish.com. We have decks, prices, metagame strategy. It's where you'll find the article for this Rough Drafts, as well as all my other articles and tons of great content from other people. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to click on that subscribe link that's going to pop up on the bottom of your screen. It'll keep you up to date on all the latest and greatest in video content from mtggoldfish.com. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the videos, enjoy our Vintage Cube, and I will talk to you soon.